Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Drew Dalton, a senior lecturer from the University of Sunderland. And I chatted to Drew about all things to do with sexuality. And I really enjoyed this chat. It was a bit like having a pint in a pub with someone. It was a really good conversation. And I think we hit it off really well. And the conversation just flowed. I could have chatted to Drew for a long time about this. I was particularly interested in the work that Drew is doing at the moment. And that's to do with LGBT Muslims, which is a really interesting piece of research. And threw up quite a lot of questions for myself. And at the end of the show, Drew will give out his details. So if you do want to learn more about his work, then please do contact him on Twitter or read some of his work, his blogs, because I think you'll find it really interesting. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Drew Dalton. I am a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Sunderland.
Great. Thanks, Drew. Where did sociology start for you? Where did it all begin?
Ooh, now that's an interesting one. So there's a bit of a long and a bit of a personal story, actually, but so here goes. I originally wanted to be an archaeologist. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And so I applied for archaeology, and I had this whole idea about being a kind of Indiana Jones figure, you know, running through temples and being chased by big stone walls and all that kind of stuff. And as it got to, because I'd never studied sociology at A level, but my school never offered that option. It just wasn't available. And I saw this course which looked fascinating, and it had topics and words like sexuality and gender and poverty and global rights, and I was like, wow, okay, what's this? And it hit the time in my kind of personal life when I was also coming out as well, and so it was a deeply personal kind of reason which made me shift entirely into studying a sociology degree. So my personal journey of sociology started then. And then that continued through kind of studying an undergrad and masters afterwards. And then I kind of left it behind and I joined the third sector, but I never really did leave it behind. It came along with me the entire time. So all the research, social research skills I developed, all that kind of stuff, I was using it in charities. I was using it in human rights organizations I was working for and volunteering for. So I think it continues with you all the way. I think very often we think of it as just an academic discipline, and it's really not. It's more than that. It has very much an impact on the world that we live in. And outside of work today, I run my own human rights organization, and I'm still using my sociology there. Yeah. So that's kind of been some of my journey so far. And that's led me to the University of Sunderland, where I'm now, you know, teaching and all the great things. I mean, I get paid to talk about all the wonderful stuff I love and enjoy. So, you know, whether I'm researching sexuality or global issues and global health, the types of stuff I'm interested in, then I get to sit and talk with interesting people all day. It's brilliant. Get paid for it.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm biased, but I think sociology should be a compulsory subject at school anyway. But
I very much agree, and I'm not sure if it's myth or fact, but I believe at one point when they were putting the national curriculum together in 1986-87, before it was launched, there was discussion of it coming in, but Margaret Thatcher deemed it too dangerous. And so it got removed.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They don't want people rioting and fighting the system, I guess.
Well, quite.
I'm guessing from your accent, you grew up in the Northeast as well.
Yes, can you tell? Yeah,
Sunderland,
absolutely. Pardon?
Sunderland, born and bred, are you?
Actually, no, I'm not. I'm from deepest, darkest Northumberland originally,
Okay.
and so I'm a rural boy,
I see.
and and it was only when I went to university, because where I come from was a mining town. I'm a real Billy Elliot, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go to university really far away," and I went to Newcastle. So, but you know, my social geography at that point in my life was tiny. I mean, I hadn't really, other than family holidays, I hadn't really been much outside of the area.
Yeah.
So Newcastle, I ended up staying in, and then lo and behold, now I'm in Sunderland.
Great. And Drew, you mentioned things like sexuality, poverty interested you when you first started sociology. Was there any particular theorists that grabbed your attention or perspectives?
Yes. I think there's been several as the years have gone on, and I feel myself gravitating towards some and moving away from others. I think originally George Ritter, I read The McDonaldization of Society, and absolutely and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a point in my life where his book had came out, and it told me about how this big global world operates, and how kind of like that Max Weber stuff, how your soul gets stomped out of the system and all that creativity gets stuck in that iron cage. And he applied all this stuff to the modern world of McDonald's, and I was like, this is brilliant. And at that point, I was starting to kind of reach a level of annoyance with big fast food industries taking over areas and removing huge amounts of workers' rights globally, all that kind of stuff. So George Ritter was a huge author for me on the kind of global stage.
Yeah.
And then on the sexuality stuff, I really enjoyed Jeffrey Weeks, and still do. Still a huge fan of Jeffrey Weeks and his stuff, which is, how historically, along with Foucault, how, all of these kind of groups at one time were never named, but they were always there. And then as soon as they've been named, you become categorized, don't you, and labeled, and then identified, and then monitored and surveyed. And they both come at it from different angles, but they both come from this fascinating point of view that actually sexuality is constructed in many ways, as many other things are.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating stuff. So I've got a long list of others. I could go on for days.
Actually, at the A-level standard, it's something that I know many academics have talked about, but the three big areas are always social class, ethnicity and gender. But sexuality certainly seems to be an area that's becoming more popular, and students are of more interest and want to discuss that area in particular.
They very much are. And I used to teach A-level sociology, and when I remember largely being absent from, other than the sociology of families, it was mainly absent from other areas. And it's a great shame, because it is starting to creep into the discussions now. People are recognizing the importance of it as a subdiscipline, which is great to see. It's absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
It seems to happen at degree level, but I think the discussion should be started a little bit earlier, personally.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
So, Drew, let's talk about your own research. You've mentioned sexuality, but what are your main areas of research and discussion?
Okay, so my path so far has been led very much by kind of HIV and AIDS, and it's been led by sexuality. The main two defining features, I would say, of what I do. I'm interested in lots of other areas, so I'm constantly tacking myself onto different projects, but they're the two main reasons. I'm very interested in why just simply being who you are, loving who you are, the society will change its attitudes toward you or alter attitudes, or in some cases, the state will control your body. And so I'm very interested in kind of how that works in terms of sexuality, especially on the global arena. So, you can have very different lived experience, can't you, in the UK compared to Russia?
Yeah.
What's going on over there in Chechnya, for example, where we're seeing people rounded into camps, and that's very state-led. Whereas the state largely leaves sexuality alone to some extent within the UK, other than enforcing law and policy. So it's really kind of interesting to see how people get buffeted and affected by that, and what that means for them. And work at the minute has been, I've just finished doing some research on people growing older with HIV. So we've had our first ever generation of people who are grown old with HIV, whereas previously they would have they died, sadly, for the most case, other than long-term survivors. So we've got this big question mark. Well, what happens next? And so doing interviews with them was fascinating. We did life history interviews and got them to talk about their lived experience of living with it and what does it mean to grow older with it and, during the life course and all that kind of stuff. Where you might have doctors on one side going, we don't actually know what happens to people when they grow old with HIV because we've never seen it before.
Yeah.
And they view it as a scientific puzzle. Like, oh, don't worry, we'll sort it out. Whereas you've got the anxieties of the people who are aging with it on the other side going, well, shoot, what about us? We have no answers. We've got no community of elders to pull any information from. And it's this really strange kind of tension that's going on between science as an institution and between the people who are, accessing that science or attempting to.
Yeah.
So it's just a fascinating piece of research. That was one of them anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to dispel this myth, okay? Don't know even if we were to include this in the podcast. But I live in Brighton, obviously, an area with a high number of LGBT. There's a pub where all the old boys drink, okay?
Yeah.
I got chatting to quite a few of them a while ago, and they said that during the 80s when some of them first contracted HIV, there was an arrangement that they would be paid their salary until their death, in quotation marks, because it was expected to anticipate to come quite soon. That was 30 years ago. They're still being paid that salary.
Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not, whether they were bragging over a pint. I don't know, but it was quite interesting chat.
I've heard of some people who were put on some of the older benefit packages that they were given at the time. I've never heard the salary thing.
Yeah.
I've heard the benefit package where they were put on the older, very generous benefits at the time because they were expected to die.
Yeah.
I do know a lot of people put cash their pensions and things like that. And it's called Lazarus syndrome. And lo and behold, antiretrovirals came out in 1996.
Yes.
And people are like, oh, we've just went on this big expensive cruise and spent our entire pensions.
Yes.
So they then have lived in poverty as a result of that. They've not all have quite got out the other end. In regards to the salary thing, though, I've never heard of that.
I wasn't sure on the validity of it, but it was a great chat anyway.
Yeah, definitely interesting.
And Drew, I know you've recently won an award for some of your work and research into LGBT communities. Is that right?
Yeah, it was blush.
Go for it.
Yeah, I was nominated for the National Diversity Awards and got shortlisted, which was really nice. I won the Northeast LGBT Awards and the Northeast Equality and Diversity Awards as well, which all at quite different times, but recently, it could be said. And so, yeah, it's a real honour. I mean, you do it because you love it and enjoy it, and you want it to make an impact.
Yeah.
So the research that I'm currently working on, if you don't mind me going into it.
No, please do.
I'm looking at the lives of LGBTQI plus Muslims, and this is working with an organisation called Hidayah, who are a nationwide UK organisation for LGBT Muslims. I was the former chair of the organisation, and then when I stepped down, we decided to look into putting together a survey which would document the lives of a very forgotten group. Because I think largely when people think of LGBT lives, they think of very secular lives, non-religious lives in the UK.
Yeah.
And so often we forget about the lived experiences of those who are still religious.
Yeah.
And so it's been fascinating. I'm just writing a book chapter which is finished. And the aim of that was to look at the unique pressures that they face that other people may not or face as boldly. So we're finding that, for example, some LGBT Muslims neither feel welcome to some extent in their own Islamic communities, maybe because of their sexuality or gender identity, but then don't feel comfortable within the LGBT community because of that very overt racism, which is what's perceived to be going on at the moment. Or actually is going on at the moment. And so in some elements it was fascinating because you can, as a practicing Muslim, you can be very comfortable with your ethnicity and Islamic identity in your own community, i.e. Islamic community, but you have to hide your sexuality. But then going to the LGBT scene, you then have to face a different set of pressures, which is about minimizing your ethnicity, hiding your Islamic identity, and being allowed to open up about your sexuality and gender identity. It's a strange tension in the middle that a lot of Muslims are facing. Sorry.
So no, I was just going to say I worked in Kenya for 3 years, and there's an area of Kenya which is predominantly Muslim, Mombasa on the coast.
Yeah.
I remember being picked up by a taxi driver from the airport. He asked me where I came from, and I said Brighton in the UK. And the first thing people tend to say about Brighton, oh, that's full of gay people, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And I said, yeah, it is. And he said to me, oh, we don't have gay people here.
Mm.
And I went, well, you do. And he went, no, we don't have gay people here. And we kind of had this back and forward. I said, well, you do. Maybe they're not openly gay. But I just wondered if there's kind of a shutting down in some Muslim communities, firstly, to say that it doesn't exist.
This is what Adrienne Rich called compulsory heterosexuality.
Yeah.
And it's that idea, isn't it, that society produces a compulsory set of ways of being. And if you break that ways of being, there are certain senses of punishments that go with it.
Yeah.
And so we've seen this before in Iran, when, the Iranian foreign minister and president famously said there's no gay people in Iran.
Yeah.
Which, at an American university, which they meant to say, we don't have this sort of stuff. Largely because, and it comes back to the state doesn't recognize it. And so it kind of goes back to what I was mentioned earlier about how you can go from one area of the world where the state will recognize you, another part where it won't. But yeah, that's quite common. And you see that in Muslim communities, especially from the people we've surveyed and the work we've done, where, they feel those discussions maybe can't be had or are never able to be had. And in some cases, those discussions may lead you to a forced marriage or things that culturally the Muslims will face that white LGBT people will never face. They'll never face those similar constraints. So when we're talking about a united LGBT community, very often we'll have to give a little bit more thought as to what that means and how there actually are subgroups within that who have very, very different needs to others. It's not a case of being special, it's just a case of having different needs, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, what would you say the other main challenges for a young Muslim coming out in the UK?
I think the key barriers really are Islamophobia. Are the key ones. I mean, it's the big question I ask is, where do you feel safe? If you don't feel safe at home and you don't feel safe in your LGBT community, where on earth do you feel safe? And so I think safety is a big question. And I think Islamophobia is on the rise. We've seen a huge uptake since Brexit. I believe there was about 400% in uptake of hate crime against religion and belief after Brexit.
Yeah,
they're huge figures. So Islamophobia is on the rise. I think we need to be having young Muslims face this difficult conversation that people don't really understand what Islamophobia is. Is it a fear of Islam or fear of Muslims, i.e. with a racial element?
Yes.
And I think we all know it's the racial element.
Yes.
And so they face problems like that, but they also face problems with, if they're coming out, it's about what's called izzat, which is the concept of honor. Very often in Islamic communities, your family comes first and your family honor rather than the individual, which you don't tend to see so much maybe within white communities, where you have much more individual choice, and whether your family honor gets tarnished or not, that's not as important. If you want to be the black sheep, that becomes a lot more problematic within very often a lot of Islamic communities, because your izzat, as coming out as a young, let's say, 18-year-old gay man, you could ruin the marriage choices or chances and opportunities of your brothers and sisters by doing so. And so you can see the tensions and levels of all this, can't you? So it's a raft of different things, I would say. Some people are in more rural areas and, where they're living in dominantly Islamic communities, but the problem isn't just faced by there, it's also faced by the government. We've got the constant surveillance of Muslims in modern day since 9/11 has been intense. Even showing an Islamic identity, i.e. a beard or dress or anything like that, can lead you to certain types of societal markers which get put upon us. And that can be problematic for them too. Yeah. So I would say there's quite a list, I would say, of things that certainly what we found. And I think, that question of safety is the things that have seemed to have filled the void. It's not all bad news and awful news. Yeah. There's some good stuff happening here. We've got this subgroup of the LGBT spectrum who have made their own sense of community, which takes the best bits of both. So you've got organizations like Hidayah, which have jumped up, and Iman and a couple of the other big ones who have filled this void where there was a void. We've got inclusive mosque initiatives where men and women pray together. Yeah. And are also really queer friendly, and it's just really interesting that this stuff's happening out there, and that it gives you hope for wider Muslim nations, doesn't it? That some of this stuff might spread.
Yeah, I was just thinking as well though. Those that are opposed, this is perhaps a difficult question, but is the Quran explicit in its views towards sexuality?
No, it's not. This one tends to be a hotbed of discussion, and it's I don't know, more relevant for religious studies class, but I'll go with it. Yeah. But it is a great book by Scott Al-Haq Kugel, who wrote about homosexuality in Islam, and it points out quite relevantly that it's never explicitly mentioned. There is a quote within there about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Bible is also in the Quran. It's called the prophet Lut or Lot in the Bible, same thing. It said that the men wanted to get at his sons and want to get into the house. The reality is it's never mentioned that it was anything to do with same-sex desire or love. It's about male rape, and that's what the story is about, and that's what's forbidden, not homosexuality or being LGBT.
So where has that come from? I mean, some people would be quite explicit that within Islam it is a sin. So
yeah.
Where's that been interpreted from the Quran, or where's that come from originally?
I think part of this has been cultural. At the same time, historically, as Islam was growing, you also had the West, which was regressing in terms of sexual rights. So you had the Dark Ages and a heavy dominance of the Catholic Church with a specific form of compulsory heterosexuality. We do know that some of that spread, those influences spread over to the Ottoman Empire and to the big Islamic empires which existed at the same time, and through trade routes. So some of those, because we've got vast evidence to show within Islamic nations at the time that sexual license was very free, and same-sex partnerships may have not necessarily been always socially approved, but were never punished.
Yeah.
There was a lot more flexibility, you could say, than there was in the West at the same point in time. And so those changes came largely from the West, and they're not helped by colonialism. Yeah. When parts of the Middle East were, colonized by the British, who brought those very Victorian attitudes with them, and they've spread, like what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, who've maintained the same laws the British give them, and implanted upon them.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to saying working in Kenya, in Nairobi, it's very much Christian-based. And the quote that's often used there as to why many believe it's unacceptable is the quote about no man should lay next to another man. But yeah, I mean, what does lay mean? Does that mean have a cuddle? Do you know what that's open to so much interpretation, right?
I know. And even then the original Aramaic is disputed in that sentence. And it's the same with the Quran. There's no sentence to even talk about the laying with. It just simply says the word to get at the sons, which implies rape, surely more than a loving relationship. Yeah. And so it's very vague. I think the role of culture plays more of a part within this. And so culture becomes a way in which religion becomes filtered down, doesn't it?
Yes.
So religious texts may say or not say one thing. Culture becomes the mechanism in which that gets transmitted. And so that's how we see varying attitudes toward women throughout the world. So you might have a very liberal state like Turkey and its attitudes toward women, for example, being a Muslim country, but secular Muslim country. But then you've got a very different state of affairs in Algeria, and culture becomes the key transmitter of that, and patriarchy as well.
Yeah. So the culture is more important than the religion itself?
Very much. And that's the stuff that's holding the LGBT Muslims into place, unfortunately. That's giving them the bother. It's not so much the religious figures and, imams and things like that. It's the role of culture. And we're also facing that same problem within the LGBT community, who are offering almost the idea that you have to be secular to fit in.
Yeah.
To be religious goes against all those oppressing forces which have harmed us in the past.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean? And it's cultural.
I have even heard the expression, being gay, that's a white person thing. I've actually heard that, So yeah, definitely cultural, certainly.
Definitely.
Thank you, Drew. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, we'll carry on this discussion a bit further. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Drew Dalton. Drew, I was just thinking of something, the controversy about what's being taught in schools, if you remember what was happening in Birmingham in particular, about whether sexuality should be on the curriculum. And it kind of sparked this debate. On one side, there was a view that, that it's homophobic, and on the other side saying, no, you're being Islamophobic. That's a really difficult one. I mean, what would you say about something like sexuality being taught in schools, being on the curriculum?
I believe, it already is.
Yes.
And that's a bit we don't often realise. Heterosexuality is on the curriculum. It's everywhere. So it's already been taught since childhood. Yeah. So just simply putting in a range of other sexualities, because they're all in the same spectrum, does no harm. And so I'm a big believer that it should be something taught about. And I think the problem is when you enter this debate with a lot of people, they tend to go, does that mean they're teaching about sex? And actually it's not, is it? When does heterosexuality teach about actual sex acts? It's incredibly rare. And so instead we would be having informed discussions about different family types and family structures. We'd be having discussions about, sexual health, which we should be anyway on a decent level. About friendships and relationships and how they form, and feelings about, how society maybe looks at that, and even looking at the role of LGBT history and how it's impacted upon the world as well. I'm a big believer in. So I say this needs to happen, and it's funny you should mention that example of the Birmingham school with the No Outsiders program. That's how I started off my book chapter with.
Yeah. By
the one community tension versus another, and then in the middle are the LGBT Muslims going, well, hang on, we're both of this. It's that intersectionality stuff, isn't it? About how we form multiple intersections of who we are. So no, I'm a proud supporter of LGBT issues being brought into schools.
Yeah, I was just thinking from the other side though. Are you sympathetic to perhaps those Muslim families or other religious families or anyone in particular that wouldn't want it on the curriculum?
Yeah, I am, and I can understand where they're coming from, and in the sense that this isn't a thing taught about in the family space. So for it to be present in a public space like a school is abhorrent to a lot of people. A lot of Islam stresses modesty in terms of modesty of action and modesty of dress and modesty of being. And so, to talk openly about sexual cultures and all that kind of stuff horrifies a lot of people, whereas that should be something very intimately bound. And so I can see why some people feel all of a sudden that's kind of that control, that they may be able to have those conversations on a very one-to-one level or ripped away from them, pushed into a school and said, right, get on with it. Your kid's going to be learning about this. So you can see why some people kind of got up in arms, can't you?
Yes.
You can have an understanding of that. But it still needs to happen, because what we are still seeing, and perhaps it could be more sensitively handled, I couldn't agree more, but we still have to have these conversations, because this, the suicide rates and the mental health rates amongst LGBT Muslims, for example, are really high. The stuff that goes with that, because somewhere along the line you've got to have this discussion. You can't hide your being for all of your life and have no harm to you whatsoever. It's impossible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see why some people got upset, but I still think that doesn't take away from the cause of being able to have a wider discussion about it within a school setting in an age appropriate way and culturally appropriate too.
Yeah, I think one of the head teachers said, whether you agree with homosexuality, bisexuality or not, the reality is it exists.
Yeah, and we'll learn about uncomfortable topics all the time. I think we need to be doing this. And I think, this is faced by uncomfortable topics faced by the LGBT community, by the Muslim community. I think we all need to be talking about this. Debate is always a healthy thing, and having these discussions needs to and must continue to happen. I remember, for example, once I had a discussion with a guy on the radio, and he was anti my view of LGBT history being taught into school. And he said, well, sexuality isn't one of the things that makes people change their decisions. Why is it so important? Why does it have to be talked about? And my response was, well, actually it does, because one of the biggest historical changes in the UK that's changed our society massively was the Reformation of the Church by Henry VIII. Huge. Split from the Pope, start up a brand new church, totally altered the future of the UK. That was based on his heterosexuality. Yes. Sexuality changes people. It changes their decisions. He wanted to remarry. So, to have those, and we had that kind of uncomfortable conversation in this radio debate. And I just thought, this is something we should be talking about. This is why these things need to be there. Some people will fundamentally never agree with me. They'll never agree with the evidence either, and the social research that goes alongside it, because they choose to ignore it. But that doesn't mean this thing shouldn't happen, because social change does work and it does take time. And that doesn't mean brainwashing. It just means change, generations change.
Yeah, and that's really interesting what you said about that sexuality is already taught in the form of heterosexuality, right? So when people are opposed to sexuality being on the curriculum, do they actually mean anything other than heterosexuality? Is that actually what they're getting at?
That's exactly what they're talking about. And this is that kind of, again, that Adrienne Rich stuff, isn't it? About compulsory heterosexuality. You're going to be taught a compulsory version of it because this is what you're going to be unless proven otherwise.
Yes.
And that's one of the ways in which power manifests, isn't it?
Yeah.
Power manifests in those very subtle, very clever ways. Anything deviant to that is seen as problematic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's really what they're meaning. It's a nice veil for homophobia to exist.
Have you worked with any young Muslim LGBT communities where someone has been completely ostracized by the family or forced away? Have you worked with anything that extreme?
Yeah, we have. I've seen some people kicked out of their homes, dishonored from families. I've seen examples of people enter what's called a mock, a marriage of convenience. And ultimately they've ended up, maybe she's been a lesbian or bi woman and he's been a gay man, and they've ended up thoroughly hating each other, and the household becomes destroyed because you still get added pressures, don't you? The expectation of children and all that kind of stuff. We've seen people being whisked away to another country to be married. I've dealt with global cases of an asylum seeker with work I do outside of work, but which is still relevant, of a guy from Sierra Leone who was held and tortured by his family for 3 days.
Wow.
Because he was found out that he had a relationship with a man. So we've seen cases of honor-based violence which happened predominantly to women, but cases against gay men. We've seen cases emerge from Turkey and in different parts of the world. And this isn't just something that affects Muslim countries. You can get this in the deep south of the USA happening to you. But we've seen quite extreme cases in some cases.
Yeah, because one of the more difficult things perhaps we could talk about is, I have heard in certain parts of the world it being mentioned, well, this is just Western imperialism trying to force that view onto communities who don't want to go in that direction. You experience that as well?
Yeah, we have. This is quite a common one. Outside of work, I hope you don't mind me promoting it.
Please do.
outside of work, I've set up a charity called Report Out. We're a global LGBT organisation, human rights one, and so we're working with Ugandan organisations at the moment. And what's happening within that is you often get the narrative of homosexuality is un-African.
Yes.
It doesn't exist, as you said about Kenya.
Yes.
It's that same kind of mentality. And so you tend to find that people's lives get erased as a result of that, even though we know that's not the case, because, you scratch back into the history books and it's very much African. Yeah. There's 2,000 to 3,000-year-old cave paintings within Nigeria which show a scene of a gay men's orgy.
Yes.
It's just, this stuff very much did always exist. But, and to some extent, it is colonial, and it is, but it's in reverse. So colonial attitudes brought a once very flourishing sexual life and different sexual identities and crushed them. Yet at the same time, the West gets blamed for that and says, well, actually, you're importing this on us. In reality, it was the West that crushed it in those nation states. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, and I was just thinking, You mentioned Uganda. Uganda's one of the countries which has got worse, isn't it? Is it the new leader, new president there?
Oh, it's any time there's an election.
Yes.
Queer people get scapegoated all the time. And because they're a great source, because they struggle to fight back and unify. And because they're illegal in that sense, it's still 14 years imprisonment, and they're talking about bringing back the Kill the Gays bill, which was an original attempt to put the death penalty on there for it. And that's since been crushed because of pressure from the international community and from the Ugandan organizations as well. But, that these get raised at points. Once you create a social deviant, you can create that nice moral panic, can't you?
Yes.
And that then can influence, people to vote for you or give you social rewards and create deviancy in others who are easily pinned upon. And they never get resolved, these moral panics, because that's purposeful. They're not meant to. And so the LGBT question will always be floating there, ready to be used as a form of attack by politicians and by the state.
And I wonder, Drew, why is it that a lot of people that are anti-LGBT are fiercely opposed, passionately opposed? Why? I mean, the argument always goes, why does it matter? If you had a gay couple living next door, even if you didn't agree, why would it bother you? Why are some people so fiercely opposed?
Well, this is a really complex one, I think. It's there's the obvious markers like, tradition, culture, to an extent religion, but I prefer to remove religion from culture, the role of the family and all that kind of stuff. But I think it goes deeper. If you look at any definition of, let's take homophobia. If you look at a definition of homophobia, it states the fear of. I don't actually think any of the actions that I've seen in the global world are largely fear-based, and so therefore that person was harmed. I think it's a root cause of something else, and there's a great piece by Plummer's work called Gender Taboo Theory, which actually says homophobia isn't about the fear of gays, it's about the fear of transgressing gender boundaries.
Right.
So heaven forbid you be seen as effeminate or crossing a line of behavior, of taking a submissive role in sex, for example, all of those things that actually cross a gender line of what a woman is supposed to be, actually fuel the root causes of what homophobia is, because heterosexuality stands in opposition to homosexuality on a binary, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so does gender, with male, female, and so the gender taboo is that taboo line. When you reach that line of crossing it, that's when society reacts. And I actually quite agree with that. I think there's a lot of validity in that argument from what Plummer's saying. And
a lot of that homophobia as well, it's fair to say that that's more directed towards male homosexuality rather than female. Is that still your experience?
It is, but I think there's forms of that, because I think with this kind of gender taboo stuff, it also aims to correct things. So, for example, in South Africa, we've got a huge problem with the use of corrective rape against lesbians. And the idea is that you can be correctively raped and therefore treated back to heterosexuality, back to the binary.
Yes.
because as a lesbian woman, you become inaccessible on that gender line to heterosexual men, and this is one way of becoming accessible and treating you again. So women do very much get it, but in some ways in different forms.
And what about bisexuality? What have you encompassed in your research to do with bisexuality?
And from a personal stance, because I'm a bisexual man, this is vastly under researched bisexuality. There was a great report by the Open University came out in 2010, which was called the Bisexual Report, and it's a first literature study of its kind in the UK to gather whatever we knew about bisexuality around. A lot of it shows actually that the B in the LGBT are, as we probably always knew, the highest population group. There's more of them than there are the L, the G, and the T.
Yes.
They are a group which is a lot more fluid, and so may move in between communities, but they tend not to use commercial queer spaces because they feel out of place. And that's largely because, if you, as a bisexual man, you take a girlfriend, you might be perceived as being straight, and the reactions to you would be very different. But you're also seen, especially amongst some older LGBT people, you're seen as a traitor because you haven't made your mind up, inverted commas, which tends to be a common one. Yeah. We do know that mental health, drug and substance misuse are higher amongst bisexuals than all other groups. And so are rates of self-harm. And I think the problem behind this is that there's an invisibility. It's by invisibility largely. Very often when we are presented in forms on the media, we're presented as being slippery creatures or untrustworthy or there to spice someone's sex life up as a threesome. Or do you see how there's a theme here going on here, isn't there? I remember when Brokeback Mountain came out many years ago, which was supposedly said it was a film between two gay cowboys and a love story, and it was really provocative because it had a sex scene, and Hollywood was doing a mainstream thing with mainstream stars. But I remember watching it at the time going, this isn't a story about gay cowboys. These two men are bisexual. Where's the evidence to point that they're gay? They have lived lives with wives and children. Nothing says gay in this film. They're actually bisexual. Yeah. And yet in news and narratives surrounding the film, it was the gay love story. And I was like, that's another good example of how bisexuality gets erased from things.
That's really interesting, that idea of invisibility, because as I mentioned, I live in Brighton, where huge communities and certain pubs and clubs are known as a lesbian pub or a gay pub. You don't tend to hear a bisexual pub, do you?
No.
Where is the spaces for those groups?
I know, and I mean, there are things like there are bisexual meeting groups spread across the UK, and there's a great thing called BiCon, which is an annual bisexuality conference, which gets held over a few-day period once a year. But bisexuals haven't mobilised as a community as readily as what lesbian and gay men have. I think for a number of reasons, but they've never been have never been as well organised as a group.
It's really interesting, even in terms of identity, isn't it? Because there could, for example, be an association of a certain look or dress with gay communities, but there's not a bi look. Does that make sense?
No. In fact, we become a fashion accessory, or we become something that's there to, like I say, spike up your love life or whatever. We get accessorized and almost made into a little bit, to some extent, a commodity.
Yeah,
a sexual commodity. Yeah. It's fascinating. Capitalism takes new forms.
And is it changing though? I mean, there must be more awareness than ever to do with sexuality. What we're seeing in the media, what we're seeing in the press, what's going into education and so on. You must have seen developments and improvements in the last 10, 15 years?
Massively. I mean, I still think we've got some things to get right, but I think there have been huge changes. I mean, we're seeing the different, the Gen X, Gen Z, generations are all growing up with very different attitudes towards sexuality as much more fluid. and actually don't even want to nail down with a bisexuality tag. So pansexuality has emerged, hasn't it? And we've got all these other kind of features which are coming out in terms of sexual identities, which, is fascinating to see. When you think about it, we're a very young movement. We're only 50 years old as a kind of open movement in the West. Obviously, it's existed long before then, but as a movement of activism, we're young. So these titles and names will continue to change, as have people who would no longer call themselves a suffragette.
Yes.
With the women's rights movement. These things change, don't they, as movements and activism forms change.
Could there be a point where you don't actually have to identify as anything? Because
no.
Because I heard someone once say, I can't think of who it was, that no one comes out as straight.
Yeah.
Why do you have to come out as gay or as bi, as pansexual?
Yeah, I think as long as the way the current power set up, that's not going to happen, because there'll always be, the way we've got now, one group is clearly more powerful. And so you will always have to come out until that ends. Whether or not that finishes, I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yes.
Let's say.
Because isn't there some research that says actually everyone's bisexual to a degree? Or
Oh yeah. It was Sigmund Freud, I think, said that originally. You're born bisexual, and then you grow out of your immature phase, as he called it, and then you make your mind up. You become deviant or you become heterosexual. There was some work from Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s and 50s with the Kinsey scale, which interviewed tens and tens of thousands of people across the USA, and came up with the Kinsey scale of the 1 to 6, exclusively homosexual, exclusively heterosexual, and actually discovered that most people are not a 1 or a 6.
Yeah.
They're a 2 or 5 and everything else in between. So there is some truth to say that I think sexuality in terms of orientation alters and is fluid.
Yeah.
And you have some people who are very happily heterosexual all their life, and then later in life decide to come out and then start new relationship types. I think we've always done this. I just think we never named these things before.
Yeah.
And that's what's changed in the last 200 years. We've named them through science and medicine and categorization.
Because even beyond sexuality, in terms of homosexuality, bisexuality, what you're attracted to, or let's put it bluntly, what turns you on, that can change over time anyway, right? Well, a fetish definitely tends to come from an experience. So
yes,
actually anything to do with your sexuality surely is fluid.
Yeah, definitely. It very much can be. You might be rooted in one firmer way than other, or, and it may, for some people, merely be a passing thought at one point in their life or not. And some people maybe never will never truly know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it is this fluid concept. I think sexuality is only what society tells us we are. And that's the beauty about sociology, isn't it? It gives you the kind of that insight. Unless society tells you what you are by the sexual actions that you take. And where you then choose to use or refute that label.
Thanks, Drew. I've enjoyed this chat.
Oh, thanks.
It's got me thinking a lot, actually. It's really got me thinking.
Cheers. I really enjoyed it too.
Cheers, Drew. Could you tell us where people can read more about your work? I know you're on Twitter as well.
Yes, I am. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you're more than welcome. It's at Drew Dalton 1980. And you can also check out my web profile on the University of Sunderland's website as well. If you want to check me out and contact me from there, I'm more than happy to.
Great. And when's the research on LGBT Muslim communities? When's that due to be released?
Oh, well, I'm hoping for later this year we should have the survey analysed. And there's a couple of book chapters coming out after that. So I reckon this is fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I'm hoping by October I should have the research report written. That'll be publicly available. It'll hopefully be on the Hidayah website, so you can download it for free and read it yourself and see what the key findings are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Drew. It's been
cheers.
Brilliant chat.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.